it's Thursday, August the 20th, and welcome to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining the social, economic, political, and geopolitical implications of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution and the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism, and it's my pleasure and honor to be your host of today's broadcast. Now, for those of you who have been watching us, and this is about 5 months into GoodFellows now, it's hard to believe we've been doing it this long, but I think 5 months has been our run now. We appreciate your loyalty, and we appreciate the kind words you have to say to us on social media. We surely appreciate it. Those of you who have not seen us before, what you're going to see for the better course of the next hour or so is a conversation featuring three Hoover Institution senior fellows, or GoodFellows as we like to call them, with a wink and a nod toward Martin Scorsese, but three Hoover senior fellows offering their unique insights to what may lie ahead in these uncertain times. Now let's meet the GoodFellows, beginning with John Cochrane. He's an economist and the Hoover Institution's Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. Hey, John, how are you?
I'm doing great. So long as the power stays on and the smoke doesn't invade, here in California, it's always fun.
That is a good question. We're also joined by Niall Ferguson from somewhere in the great beyond of California, his wilderness outpost. Niall is a renowned historian and author, and he is the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow. Hello, Niall. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Bill, if it's any consolation, John, it's pretty smoky out here too. Feels like the whole country's on fire. In fact, it's getting pretty biblical. You just told me, I think, that lightning struck the Hoover Tower. I'm feeling that a plague of locusts can only be days away.
The locusts come.
All right. Our third good fellow, last but certainly not least, is Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He is the Hoover Institution's Fawad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow. H.R., how are you today?
Good, Bill. Good to see you and John and Neil.
Well, gentlemen, we've agreed to dedicate this episode and next week's broadcast of GoodFellows to discussing the elephant and the donkey in the room, which would be the health of the Democratic and Republican parties in America, this week and next being the two parties' national conventions. Now, before we get into this, a word to all those listening. The Hoover Institution is a nonpartisan, nonprofit operation. We are not going to skewer Democrats exclusively this week. We're going to be critical at some points, but rest assured that next week when we turn our attention to the Republicans, we will have a few unkind words to say, I imagine, such as politics in America in 2020. But this week, gentlemen, let's talk about the Democrats. And here's what I'd like to throw out at you as an opening question. It's easy to poke fun at Joe Biden. It is easy to point out the irony of a party that wants to avoid the appearance of socialism, scheduling a convention in a city that was once the socialist capital of America. But having said all of that, gentlemen, is there maybe something kind of big that we should be looking at? A wave that is coming offshore, a wave not unlike 1980 where we didn't see it coming, but afterwards we thought we should have seen it coming. Gentlemen, is there a hard push to the left coming up? And Niall Ferguson, why don't you run with this?
Well, it's hard for me to compare this with 1980. It seems to me that what's most striking about Joe Biden and the Democratic Party is it would like to be seen with Joe Biden as candidate is that it's so old-fashioned, that it really is harking back to a different era, the era in which Joe Biden's career was launched. I said years ago that populism had a relatively short half-life historically, and that it tended to be followed, at least in the US, by progressivism. And sure enough, as it seems like populism has burnt itself out metaphorically, as well as literally in California, you can see that we're almost certain, or not certain, but likely to have the progressive alternative. But it's so tired. Unlike in the early 1900s, when progressivism and its European equivalent, social democracy, were new and exciting and offered some semi-plausible solutions to the big problems of the industrial urban society of that time, I'm struck by the kind of tired quality of what is ultimately on offer here. And the reason that they're putting Biden up front is, I think, pretty obvious, that they don't want to present voters with the real radicalism which the left wing of the Democratic Party currently stands for. They want to make believe that with Uncle Joe, we can get back to the days of normalcy when folks work together and solve problems in a bipartisan way. It sort of turned the clock back progressivism, which almost sounds to me like a contradiction in terms. If you look at the Biden program, wade your way through it, as I've tried to do, it's good old-fashioned spend and tax. Huge spending is envisaged, and it's pretty hard for Republicans to argue against that after the huge spending that they've committed to in the past 8 months, and pretty significant increases in direct taxation, though nothing near enough to cover the increased spending that's envisaged. So it's the old progressivism, it's the old Democratic Party that voters are being offered here. And I think that's kind of somewhat dispiriting, to be honest, as well as I think a little bit deceptive, because it's clear that there's another Democratic Party just visible in the wings and certainly visible in some of the sort of chat rooms that are going on with significantly smaller audiences.
Well, John Cochrane, Rahm Emanuel, a pretty smart guy, we would agree. Rahm Emanuel, a former congressman, Bill Clinton's chief of staff, I believe, when he was president, and most notably former mayor of Chicago. John Cochrane, part of the first say, all wisdom lies in Chicago. Rahm Emanuel wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal on Saturday in which he talked about this election and used the phrase, quote, generational transformation. I'd like to read a little passage to you, John, in which Emanuel talked about Democrats needing to, quote, focus on what happens after Trump has been ushered off the stage. In other words, he thinks Democrats need to be talking about specifics as to what will they do. But we, for the last 3 nights, now granted, we're doing this before Biden's acceptance speech. We don't know if he'll get into specifics. But this convention's been pretty notable for avoiding specific things they want to do in 2021. The theme has been, let's get rid of Donald Trump. So do you think a generational transformation is indeed working here?
So I hope, let's put on the agenda to talk about in 20 minutes specifics as far as what's going to happen with policies, schools, cities, energy, monetary policy, and so forth. And so I want to put that shit down. We'll talk about it later and stick with your big issue question. I think I disagree a little with Neil. I do see more of a wave coming. There is an elephant in the room. His name is Trump. We wouldn't be here now with the Democratic Party doing what they were if there weren't quite a lot of dissatisfaction with the personality and antics of the current occupant. And I think what they're doing is go just left enough to stay just moderate enough to barely win the election is the strategy. Biden is clearly saying as little as possible. Now, they did decide not to go full on progressive. They did not, AOC and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are not their presidential candidates. But as I see it, the old, I love the way Neil put it, the late 1960s, early 1970s, the septuagenarians are being put up sort of as the stuffed front, the ones we talk about, so that the middle of the road voters won't be scared to death. But who will actually be writing the laws? Who will be writing the rules? Who will be writing the dear colleague letters? Who will be writing the subpoenas? Who will be running the investigations? Who wrote the Democratic Party platform that Neil tried to go through? That will be clearly in the hands of the young and the energetic, not the septuagenarian symbols who are up there to make us feel like it's all going to be kumbaya come November 7th. And they are a strong political force. Now, I agree with Neil. As far as ideas are concerned, the modern progressivism is mostly noticeable for the nuttiness of its ideology. But ideology has always been an opiate for the masses. This is about power, the getting of power, the taking of power, the keeping of power. And they will use the machinery of the government in order to send things to people who support them. And we can talk about that more in the policy things. But I think that is really, the situation is who's going to be running things, because what matters is the details. And it's clear the energy of Biden and Pelosi and that generation in their upper 70s is not going to be the energy that does. What they have to stand for is what Walter Mondale stood for in 1984. It hasn't changed that much, just a little more of the same. We can talk about a little more unions, a little more subsidies to this, a little more subsidies to that. But who will actually be running things are the young progressive millennials, and they are a political and ideological force to be reckoned with.
Didn't work out too well for Mondale, though, now did it? 49 out of 50 states he lost. HR, Monday nights, the opening night of the Democratic Convention, I found rather remarkable in this regard. And it wasn't what Michelle Obama had to say. It was what others had to say time and again, in which they held Donald Trump directly responsible for the deaths of Americans. You heard this repeatedly. Donald Trump has killed 150,000 Americans. He's killed 170,000 Americans. This strikes me as a real interesting move in rhetoric in American politics. I remember the 2004 Democratic Convention in Boston, HR. I don't remember a orphan from 9/11 standing on the stage and blaming George W. Bush for the death of everybody in the World Trade Center, for example. So is this a reflection of Donald Trump, or is this a larger reflection, HR, of where rhetoric has gone in politics and really American discourse now?
Yeah, Bill, I think that was the most disappointing aspect of the convention for me, was to see the blame being placed at the feet of the president, right? And I think it's legitimate, right? You can criticize the president for the COVID-19 response, but to blame the president for the effects this virus has had overall, and to give the total numbers of deaths as being directly attributable to the president, I think it's abhorrent. I think, sadly, though, it's not atypical. Our vitriolic, partisan, rhetoric and discourse has been moving in this direction. I'm hoping, did we reach bottom with this? I hope we reached bottom with this, but I fear that we haven't. And what's sad about this is, whenever there is this kind of extreme position, ridiculous position, it tends to elicit just as an extreme and ridiculous position on the other end of the political spectrum. And so what happens? We pull ourselves apart, and then if we're going to talk about, as you're suggesting, Bill, what are the concrete recommendations associated with the problems we're facing that we're never going to get to it, right? Because we'll be so busy, kind of accusing each other of just ridiculous and egregious acts. It was disappointment for me, but sadly, it's not atypical of the political discourse as we've witnessed it, right, over. I would say the last couple of administrations, even going back to the George W. Bush administration, I think it really began to unravel in this way.
HR and Bill, I wonder if I could jump in here with a point that has I don't think been made. At least I haven't seen it made. If you think back to the Obama presidency, it's not like they didn't have their epidemic, although nobody has mentioned it this week, but there were 3 waves of opioid overdoses that swept through the United States during the Obama presidency, and more than doubling the opioid-related death rate in the time that he was in the White House. And in total, more than 365,000 Americans died of drug overdoses between 2009 and 2016. And each year, the death toll was higher than the year before. And unlike COVID-19, the age groups affected were relatively young. It was actually those between 25 and 54 who were most affected. Now, nobody, to my knowledge, during or at any point after the Obama presidency, blamed Barack Obama for those deaths. But you don't need to be a John Cochrane level economist to recognize that the death toll is higher than for COVID-19. The number of life years lost is significantly higher. And this happened each year for 8 years and got steadily worse without any solution being found. And I do find myself asking why it is that Donald Trump is to blame for the deaths caused by COVID-19 in the space of just a few months, in a way that, of course, has been seen in many other countries, and indeed worse in a number of European countries. And yet we completely pass over the catastrophe of the opioid epidemic during the Obama years as if it simply had nothing to do with him. And this brings me to a point that has really been bugging me all week. I listened and reread President Obama's speech this week. Initially, my response was, this is a good and well-crafted speech, and I can't help but agree with much of it. But I found myself wondering what was missing, and then it hit me. No acknowledgement at all that there might be some causal relationship between the Obama presidency and that backlash that produced Donald Trump's victory in 2016. Nobody, it seems to me, at this convention has an answer to the question of why it was, if the Obama years were so wonderful, Donald Trump was elected 4 years ago, and it was missing too from Kamala Harris's entirely solipsistic speech. So I do feel that there's something a little bit troubling here. If these people are going to win, they don't seem to have learned anything from defeat 4 years ago, and they don't seem to have any understanding of why they were repudiated at the ballot box 4 years ago.
Well, I don't think they have to. I mean, to follow up with HR, even more so, I've been struck that in this criticism, neither at the time nor now are they saying, well, here's what we would have done different. We would have gotten the CDC off their butts to certify a test and not sit on it for 21 days. We would have gotten the FDA to allow people to have tests. We would have gotten vaccines going quicker. You're hearing, we would have banned international travel. Nothing. There's no alternative program, even with hindsight, of what they would have.
Or national stockpile of PPE equipment.
Or we would have allowed you to.
We would have not allowed these supply chains to become so fragile, and based on exclusively efficiency without the stocks necessary to. And these problems weren't confined only to the Trump years. I mean, these were problems that go beyond. And
let's get back to the. Let's get back to.
So unfortunate, John.
But the point, you're exactly right. It is an empty finger to point, but they don't have to. The strategy is where it's simply make fun of Donald Trump. It's not about vote for us on a positive message. They know their positive message is one that a large majority of the electorate, if they knew what it was, don't want. It is the antics of Donald Trump gets people to vote against Donald Trump the same way. In 2016, lots of people voted against Hillary Clinton. A lot of the polling is not that they love Donald Trump. A lot of the polling was that they felt disparaged by Hillary Clinton and by that party. Just be quiet about what you're going to do. Keep the focus on Trump. That is the strategy of what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, Neil, it seems to me we have a historic parallel. This is a revolution of sorts in that the public wants to uprise against an unpopular ruler. But revolutions are driven by a force, and revolutions have results, and revolutions have agenda. But Neil, what is the agenda of this revolution, or is this indeed a revolution?
Well, I think we had a revolutionary situation in the United States in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And I think if you look at the scale of the protests that unfolded after Memorial Day and that ran right the way through to July, it was remarkable in terms of the numbers of people and the numbers of cities where protests happened and the level of violence that there was, spilling over into full-blown iconoclasm in places. But it then did, as these protests tend to do historically, it petered out. And what's left, I think, is a kind of leitmotif of gesturing towards the idea of Black Lives Matter. And we've seen that in numerous ways this week. I think what's striking about this is the extent to which it's possible to have a kind of revolution of virtue signaling that changes relatively little. I'm observing the way big tech billionaires write checks to organizations or institutions engaged in the critical race theory, in advancing the notion of systemic racism. The journalist Matt Taibbi made a very good point a few weeks ago in which he said that this kind of thing, where you write a check so that Ta-Nehisi Coates' ideas can be communicated to people in middle school, and that's it. You're done, and you can carry on in your relatively unregulated technology company in Silicon Valley, having done really very little to alter the fundamental and real problems of socioeconomic disadvantage that African Americans experience. And this is what I think is interesting about the Democratic Party, that in many ways, whatever its rhetoric, which is often quite egalitarian in its language, in practice, it actually does nothing to address the problems of disadvantage at the lower end of the income distribution. The Obama years widened the inequalities in American life. They actually did very little for African Americans. The Trump administration, up until COVID-19 struck, did quite a bit more measurably to improve the economic lot of African Americans and reduce the gap in unemployment rates between whites and non-whites in America. So I think this is a fake revolution in which wealthy people with very large stock portfolios, I'm thinking here of Susan Rice, who was another candidate for the vice presidential part of the ticket, carry on leading the good life, whether it's in Silicon Valley or Napa Valley or in the Hamptons over the summer or on Martha's Vineyard. But they're made to feel good by speeches like the ones that we've heard this week, knowing that in the end, there really won't be fundamental change because the Democratic Party isn't really serious about improving the lives of people at the bottom of the income distribution. It would rather actually keep them there in positions of dependence, reliant on welfare, and equipping them with a kind of subject matter for their litanies of virtue signaling.
Can I follow on? I want to sort of disagree and sort of not. I think there is a chance of a revolution here. Revolutions happen when the ancien regime turns out to be rotten and lots of people vote it out. And I think that's what they're counting on, is vote out Trump and Trumpism. And then a small, well-organized minority can grab power and use it ruthlessly. That's sort of like the Russian Revolution. There was no widespread vote to have the Bolsheviks come in. There was widespread revulsion at the Tsar, but then they grabbed power with a good program and an ideology and took with it. And that's the kind of revolution, if we're going to have one, that we're going to have now. The progressive, and they're 30, 40% tops of the electorate, but they can come in under revulsion with Trump and then grab power. And they know how to use it effectively, and they know they have an ideology to go with it. It's not just corporations. I received a letter from the American Economic Association instructing us to read Mr. Coates's work and not Tom Sowell's work, actual economists who say something about race. The virtue signaling, and this is what the bourgeoisie does. It says yes, yes, yes to the young revolutionaries, leave us out of trouble. And then next thing you know, they're in trouble too, as the left is now eating its own. I agree entirely with what Niall says. As we look at this movement, it is lots of America woke up to the difficulty of Black lives and the fact, but not the political movement, that Black lives do matter, and they will destroy Black lives. They are now leaving cities behind. They have many of the riots are white kids from the suburbs in mom's basement who go to Black neighborhoods and burn down the businesses. This looks a lot like Tulsa, except for the different rhetoric involved. I was amused that the Reverend Al Sharpton was on TV last week saying, you latte drinking liberals with your ideas stay behind. We need cops in our neighborhoods.
But you have had those that have no identity with the communities, that don't live in any of the danger of the gun violence, that are now trying to put us in harm's way to fit some purist latte liberalism that they advocate.
The cities are falling apart, and the Black lives that live in those cities are going to be hurt dreadfully by this waves. And don't look for redress. What will the government do? We had a war on poverty, and it ended up in poverty won, as the joke goes. We didn't end up actually sending money to poor people. We ended up sending money to organizations that support policies for poor people. And that's what I forecast will come out of this as well. Don't count on any actual improvements in Black lives. Count on teachers' unions being put back into force, which will destroy another generation of inner city Black lives by denying them an education. Lots of organizations that support the electoral prospects of Democrats will get lots and lots of money. But as Niall says, the fate of especially inner city African Americans will doubtlessly be worse under progressive governance than it is now.
Well, John, thank you for mentioning the Russian Revolution, because as Neil was talking, Kerensky came to mind. And Joe Biden is perhaps a four-year proposition given his age. Kamala Harris is 56 years old later, turns 56 in October, so maybe she could do 12 years in national politics. She would leave office at age 68, which is a pup by today's standards. But I'm looking at AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who also has a birthday coming up in October. She turns 31. That is the same age that Joe Biden was when he came to Washington in 1973. Now, I don't know the likelihood of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez staying around Washington for the next half century. I think there's a very interesting bet to be made about whether she'll be in Congress 4 years from now, or hosting a show on NBC, or maybe doing a deal with Netflix for content. But the question is her movement. She was given 97 seconds at the convention to speak, but the young acolytes who follow Alexandria Cortez, who want to come into Congress, who want to be in the system, do they intend to actually come into the system and work in the system? In other words, can you have a revolution without getting into the system, actually trying to change from within?
I think it just depends on what kind of change, right? What is the agenda?
Right.
What we've been talking about is it's really easy to be against something. It's more difficult to be for something, and especially before something in a way where you can make real proposals that might actually get something done, that might actually address the actual problems. As we're talking about, the inner cities today and defund the police, really that's the solution that's going to destroy those neighborhoods, that's going to reduce economic activity, that is going to exacerbate inequality of opportunity. It's just the opposite. It's the wrong solution. Look at the energy sector and the interrelated problems of energy and carbon emissions and global warming. Hey, the Green New Deal would be a disaster, right? It doesn't address the problem effectively. It's a non-solution. What are you going to do? Ban fracking? Ban fracking. Fracking was and the access to cheap natural gas was the largest resulted in the largest reduction in carbon emissions in human history. Mm-hmm. And we're going to throw that out. So I just think that what we really need is we need to have conversations about these issues, and we need the American public to educate themselves about the problem sets, right? So yeah, I'm reading this book now. I'm really enjoying it. It's called The Color of Law. It's about how laws, especially after the post-World War II period, mm-hmm. really created segregation, helped create segregation and inequality of opportunity. Now, it's kind of a sad story, but we should look at the silver lining, which means if policy played a role in creating inequality of opportunity, well, policy can play a positive role in addressing that problem set. Education, as John said, is a tremendous part of this problem set. But what we're not hearing are real solutions. What we're hearing is an ideological position that frankly just is not that well informed on these issues. And this is what the American people ought to demand from their politicians. And I think the first step in doing that is for our electorate to become as best educated as they can about these issues.
Okay, so let's educate them a little bit, and I'd like to assign each of you a policy area. Neil, I want to begin with you. Kamala Harris had an interesting phrase last night, and her phrase was, "There is no vaccine for racism." I'm a recovering speechwriter, so I know how phrases like that happen. Somebody writes that, they think that's very clever, it sounds good. I'm not sure what it means, though. There is no vaccine for racism. You study culture. You've been studying America becoming unhinged along these lines. What happens in 2020, 2021? Is there a pursuit of a vaccine for racism?
Well, I mean, the simple answer to the question is, oh, yes, there is. And it's the way you're brought up by your parents and the way you're educated. And though I'm now in my mid-50s, I was brought up by two wonderful Scottish graduates, the first in their families to go to university. Glasgow in those days was an entirely white city. But they made it clear to me from my earliest years that there was no difference between people based on skin color. And you should treat all people the same. That was the first political lesson I ever learned. I know that because I found that I'd written it down when I was 10 on a little scrap of paper. So I think there is a vaccine against racism. That's clear. The problem is I worry very much that the left has already decided that the way it's going to conduct its vaccination scheme is through a whole variety of institutional initiatives, not least at the universities, but also in schools and in corporations, that are actually going to be counterproductive and will not, in fact, instill in people the central notion of respect for all individuals, regardless of skin color or, for that matter, religion or any other differentiating factor. I think it's very interesting to read some of the more critical thinkers on these issues in the African-American community. We heard on this show from Roland Fryer at the height of the protests, and I thought it was illuminating. I've been reading a lot of Coleman Hughes's commentary on this, and the recurrent theme of Coleman's writing is that the people who portray themselves as the anti-racists and whose books have become required reading, bestsellers, partly because corporations are kind of shamed into buying them and distributing them, they are in fact the racists. That paradoxically, the people who proclaim themselves to be anti-racists are in fact the ones who want to essentialize race by insisting that white people are uniquely burdened with historical guilt that somehow can never be expunged. So it seems to me that the left doesn't actually have a vaccine for racism at all. It has something that is calculated to spread it and make it a permanent condition in our societies, and a kind of weird reversal. I've spotted this a couple of years ago when the New York Times started to run op-eds by people saying that actually they wouldn't let their black children play with white children. And I thought to myself, hang on, is this the segregation of the left that we're now confronting? So I think there's a vaccine, all right, but I don't think it's what the Democrats are planning to inject us with, sadly.
All right, John and HR, what balance do you see in terms of grievance versus empowerment? Because it seems this party is leaning very heavily toward grievance right now, issues like reparations. But what about the empowerment side, lifting people out of poverty?
I look at things in a political line. I agree with Neil. Where we're learning to become less racist comes from is the civil society, your parents, your churches, your upbringing, and simply the spread of what is clearly a morally right thing to do, which America actually should be fairly proud of, considering the depths we came out of in this on how we've done. Experience helps. I went to a 90% black high school. That helped a lot. It helps to actually know some African Americans rather than let this be entirely abstract. Where it doesn't come from is from the federal government, from ever more intricate laws, rules, virtue signaling about which authors you read while you live in your nice white suburb. But that's not convenient politically. And you want to look what's happening. I think the politics of it. We are headed towards a Lebanese system of organizing the spoils of power around racially organized groups. Neil is exactly right. There's a strong movement towards segregation in a lot of the progressive things in order to form such groups and have them be more effective political groups. That's where we are headed as it becomes more political, and that just makes the tensions between, that certainly, look at Lebanon, that doesn't make the religious, ethnic, or racial groups get along better to formally organize the spoils of politics along racial lines. And that's the answer that they are, that's what they're doing, and it's going to have exactly the opposite effect.
All right, HR, you would not be surprised to know that I'm assigning you foreign policy. The foreign policy portion of the convention was handled by John Kerry, who seemed to portray a pretty vivid picture of foreign policy under Barack Obama and the suggestion that the Biden administration would return to the Obama days. So let's talk about what the most notable changes would be in foreign policy. I assume it's climate change. I assume it's Iran.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I'll tell you that the greatest success of the Obama administration's foreign policy was to empower Iran across the greater Middle East. And I think that they're just waiting to welcome Iran back into the international community because, as Neil alluded to, the nostalgic view of those Obama years, I think is highly inaccurate, and it doesn't acknowledge that those years created many of the problems that we're dealing with today. Didn't create them, but exacerbated them. Mm-hmm. And in particular, it's this belief that our disengagement from complex problem sets overseas is an unmitigated good. And this is quite explicit in the Obama administration policy toward the Middle East, that that we were going to have a courageous withdrawal from the Middle East and opting out of really any effort to kind of influence developments in the region associated with the Syrian civil war, the disengagement from Iraq completely in December of 2011. That would actually make the situation better because they tended to see us as the problem in the region. And of course, we know what happened subsequently in the Syrian civil war, one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes since the end of World War II, the rise of ISIS. ISIS takes over territory the size of Great Britain and inflicts horrible suffering on the people in the region, and creates a refugee crisis, right, which spills over into other countries and into Europe. So I think that they have not revised really their approach based on what should have been lessons learned, especially that Iran is not going to modify its behavior, is not going to end its 40-year-long proxy war with the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel, and with the Arab monarchies.
Right.
And one of the new realities in the region is that in the region there's a recognition that Iran is the real problem, and therefore you're starting to see some of these new relationships develop, like the UAE and Israel, like the rest of the Gulf states, seeing their interests align more with Israel on Iran. Then they diverge over issues like the Israeli-Palestinian issue set. So I mean, I think what's sad about it is every administration seems to now define their foreign policy mainly by their opposition to the administration they replace, and therefore doesn't learn the lessons from even our most recent experiences and apply them to a thoughtful foreign policy going forward. The worst thing to do would be try to resurrect the kind of agreement with Iran under the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal. The worst thing to do would be to alleviate sanctions on Iran as a result of that, and give them more money, throw them a rope, as they are experiencing constraints associated with the sanctions that have been put back in place on the regime. So I just think, from a foreign policy perspective, the worst thing to do would be to replicate the Obama years. Now, I will say just quickly, sadly, some of the recent Trump administration decisions seem to be kind of aligned with the Obama administration approach to the region. And there is sort of this drive toward retrenchment, disengagement from these problem sets, and the belief that this is an unmitigated good that cuts across both parties. So just as we were talking about, whether it's education, climate, equality of opportunity, or energy and so forth, it really applies to foreign policy as well. We need to really try to understand these problems on their own terms, understand what vital interests of ours are at stake, and then have a discussion about what should our goals and objectives be. What are limitations on the influence we have? How can we work with partners to build a better future internationally and address these problem sets overseas before they reach our shores? I just don't see any discussion like that happening, really, across the Democratic Party, but even at times within the Trump administration as well.
Neil, I haven't heard a word about China, have you?
I was wondering when we get to China, because one thing's for sure, if there is a Biden administration, it won't be turning the clock back to the Obama second-term policy on China. It's worth reminding ourselves that the Obama administration thought it was going to pivot to Asia, thought it was going to sort of turn away from the Middle Eastern mess and come up with a coherent strategy for China. It failed to the point that the phrase pivot to Asia became the subject of jokes in Beijing. And by the end of Obama's term, if you look at the national security strategy written by HR's predecessor, Susan Rice, it essentially was a recommendation to accept the rise of China as a kind of unstoppable force. Something that the United States, which after all wasn't so exceptional anyway, should just get used to. So there's no way that Biden can go back to that for one very simple reason. Donald Trump has changed the national view of China, and it's one of the few bipartisan issues in America today. If you look at the latest Pew research, an even bigger swing towards an unfavorable view of China has happened amongst both Republicans and Democrats, amongst older Americans and younger Americans. And in that sense, I think the Democrats have understood that the only way that you can handle the China issue in 2020 is to try somehow to be more hawkish than Trump on China. So I think this is a really interesting issue because there is a chance, I wouldn't say it was my base case, but there is a chance that the whole thing could blow up before the election. Notice, as we speak, the pressure is being increased on Huawei. The Commerce Department had already issued rules that were going to be very problematic for Huawei come September. They ramped it up some more in the past week. The reality is that Huawei pretty soon is going to be cut off from all sources of imported semiconductors, including the very high-end ones manufactured in Taiwan by TSMC. So there is some chance in my mind that this is such pressure on China that it is actually going to provoke some kind of a response from Beijing. And we could suddenly find ourselves facing a China-Taiwan crisis before we get to election day. I think this would be a big headache for the Democrats for one very obvious reason that I hardly need to explain to you gentlemen, that a foreign policy crisis has one guaranteed effect. It makes the president front and center of media coverage, and it causes the challengers to vaporize and disappear. So I think China could yet become an issue. A lot depends on what the Chinese themselves decide to do. My impression is, and I'd be interested to hear HR's thoughts on this, is that they are pulling back from confrontation. Even the so-called wolf warrior diplomats are sounding distinctly soft soapy at the moment. And I think the calculation in Beijing is we do not want to show down now, no matter how painful this is, because we really quite welcome the idea of a Biden presidency. But I just don't think you can rule out an escalation because the pressure being applied to China's economy is very great indeed.
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly because I want to hear John's comments on this as well. But I think you're absolutely right, Neil. This was, I think, the most fundamental shift we put in place during the Trump administration. The administration has carried it forward. And I do think that what China wants to do is they want to get back, right, to not just the Obama years, but then the George W. Bush years before that, really administrations that had bought into the assumption generally that China, having been welcomed into the international order economically, would liberalize its economy, play by the rules, and eventually liberalize its form of governance. Now it is an inescapable conclusion that those assumptions were fundamentally flawed and demonstrably false. And I think that there are three, though, misperceptions still on the part of some of the Democratic Party that could lead to unwise policies vis-a-vis China. The first of these is that, hey, this is really a U.S.-China problem. And of course, they're playing in to the Chinese Communist Party's narrative when they say that, right? Hey, how is it a U.S. problem when Chinese soldiers and the PLA, People's Liberation Army, are bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier? How is it a U.S. problem? Did we cause them to intern over 1 million Uyghurs and actually to conduct a campaign of cultural genocide in which Uyghur birth rates are down 60% due to forced abortions, forced sterilizations, and forced implantation of IUDs into women? Is it a U.S.-China problem that Chinese vessels are ramming and sinking Malaysian fishing vessels, or ramming Vietnamese vessels in the South China Sea, or threatening Taiwan, or launching a huge cyber attack on Australia, or attacking our medical labs and research facilities and our hospitals during a pandemic? I mean, really? And the wolf warrior diplomacy? And so that's just a myth that it's a problem that we've kind of created, because Trump is so abrasive. The second myth is, hey, there's no multinational cooperation here. There's tremendous multinational cooperation ongoing on China right now. You can see the pendulum shifting in Europe, right? And I think the administration has put kind of a full court press on this. Secretary Pompeo gets back, I think, tomorrow after a trip to Central Asia and South Asia concerning the problem set associated with China. And we've seen multinational indictments and sanctions and all sorts of military cooperation, diplomatic cooperation, new standards, right, for infrastructure investment to counter some of the worst lending practices of the Chinese. I could go on. I'm not going to. The third myth is is that what we just need to find more areas of cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party. And this is what I worry about, kind of a restarting of these dialogues that we've engaged with China that actually led nowhere and just created the illusion of potential progress so the Chinese Communist Party could continue its economic and military and diplomatic aggression against us unchecked and uncontested. And so I think that there have been a range of actions taken. You mentioned, Neil, the restriction of access to chips, which you pointed out actually years ago. You mentioned this fleeting window of opportunity to use this element of leverage in a decisive way. I'm happy to see it. I am afraid, even though there is, you rightly pointed out, a bipartisan consensus on the problem of China, that the policies, again, this in reaction to Trump, right? Anything Trump did must be wrong. Therefore, we should put in these other policies. I'm concerned that there'll be a backing off on some of these initiatives, which I think are immensely important to the competition with the Chinese Communist Party. And finally, I'll just say, those who argue for this return to cooperation, they pose a false dilemma. As you mentioned, the false dilemma is either to go back to the old policy of managing our own decline, right, and accommodating the Chinese Communist Party, or hey, it's going to be war. Well, actually, I don't believe that in the Thucydides trap. I believe that actually, if we had continued to accommodate the Chinese Communist Party, they would get more and more aggressive, as they were in the South China Sea and elsewhere, and that would put us on a path to confrontation. So, I think that this is a big issue. It should be a campaign issue, something to talk about. As John mentioned in the beginning, it should be an issue talked about with really a degree of specificity about what are the objectives, what are the policies. And John, I know we're back to China, so over to you.
Well, I want to get us back to domestic policy because I have some.
And I want to do economics with you, John, specifically.
Yeah. And I don't want to, I think we're going to have many more talks on the wisdom of Cold War II and how to handle China. But I will grant you that both parties seem to be headed in the same direction, as unwise as I think it is. And what happens is that after a change of administration, lots of words get said, each administration quietly accepts things that it may have yelled about but are convenient. And it is true that the Democrats are as happy to China bash as the Republicans right now. Bernie Sanders' view on trade is quite similar to Donald Trump. I think Sanders even was upfront about that at some point. So mercantilism, protectionism, bring back the jobs of the 1950s is as much in his rhetoric as Trump's rhetoric. So I think they will go along and continue Cold War II. And we can, after this is over, go back to discussing the wisdom of it rather than where does it fit in current presidential politics.
John, I've got a quick comment because I read The Grumpy Economist, as I always do, and you suggested a bit of a moral equivalency, I thought, with the Chinese Communist Party and its mercantilist policies. I'll tell you, I mean, the person who's been working on this, Bob Lighthizer, I think he's one of the most competent people I've ever met, and always his approach with trade enforcement mechanisms, at least when I knew him there, was that those trade enforcement mechanisms were to ultimately get back to a place where you didn't have to use them, and really what precipitated the use of tariffs, the trade enforcement mechanisms to get China's attention, were a whole range of unfair trade and economic practices associated with forced transfer of intellectual property, sensitive technologies, limited and not reciprocal access to their market. So I don't see the equivalency there. And I think that there are structural problems with a statist economic system that uses what it perceives as its relative advantages against our free market economic systems.
Okay, wait. We're getting off the track of Biden and the Democrats. I want to have this discussion. I want to have it the week after next. But I don't want to get away with the words moral equivalence between us and the Chinese. I never said anything about moral equivalence. Equivalence of idiocy. We may be shooting the boat as to make them stop shooting the boat if you'd like, the holes in the boat if you'd like. But no, there's no moral equivalence between the U.S. and China. Let's get back.
Okay, I'll drop the moral.
No, no,
You're
and let's
suggesting an equivalency.
Let's have this discussion. And I'll
We got about 10 minutes of show left, and before missiles fly between Neil and John, let's stick with economics. And gentlemen, what I want to talk about the time we have left is perhaps the emerging of economics and social justice. Let's call it economic justice. Now, I'm in California, so is John Cochrane, so is HR. Neil will be joining us back here one day. As I speak, the legislature is looking at raising taxes on millionaires. They want to up the bracket by a few points. They're considering a wealth tax. If you have more than $30 million in your fortune, the state of California is going to come after you for up to 10 years, regardless of where you have it. But let's talk about Washington. And John, why don't you lead this off? If there's a difference between Democrats, young and old right now, and between Bernie and Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren, it is the idea of capitalism, and the idea of capitalism being bad and wealth being bad.
So I think this is, as usual, ideology to spoon feed to as opiate to the masses, and doesn't really describe what they're going to do. And let me just, if I just step through what I think we are likely to see under the administration headed by Biden, but really run in all its details by AOC, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and the New Progressives. What are we likely to actually see? And can we put a better unifying story on that than the story of we're following the ideology to bring justice to the people? Mm-hmm. What are they going to do to schools? They're going to kill, Joe Biden said so, they're going to kill charter schools, clamp down on parochial and private schools. They're going to really buck up the teachers' unions to the destruction of education of especially minorities and poor people. Why? Teachers' unions support Democrats, obvious. What are they going to do about energy? Welcome the rest of the country to California, where we got rid of our fossil fuels in advance of, and don't have the renewals yet, and they are turning the lights out. Once again, surprise, surprise, it gets hot occasionally. You're going to see the same thing. Pipelines will be stopped. Fossil fuel development will be stopped. Someday, maybe the renewables will come. There will be an enormous amount of green pork, which will line pockets of friendly Democratic donors, will do nothing to reduce carbon or the global temperature. Mm-hmm. What are they going to do about, well, we know what's happening to unions. By the way, welcome to California, where I think it's tomorrow, Uber and Lyft go out of business, because labor they're all going to be regulated.
No, a judge just imposed a stay on that, so they're temporary.
Well, we came within a day of destroying Uber and Lyft. Obviously, the same kind of thing is coming to employment near you. What does that do? It means everybody has to be in a big company, a big union, and we all do what the politicians would like us to do. A regulation of the internet. They're not dumb. The internet is where we talk, and it's not just about money. It's about making sure that speech gets done the way it is. There'll be a big regulatory onslaught, both by formal means, dear colleague letters, informal means, imposition. What does this really mean? This means guanxi. This means you need to have the connections in order to keep the regulators off your back. So pretty much in every, how do you put that together? What's that really? Oh, taxes. Taxes, it's not just a couple bracket points. The proposal actually in the state legislature is 16% state tax rate on top of it's going to be at least 40% federal tax rate, non-deductible, wealth tax as well. Now, what does that mean? That means good year to be a tax lawyer. I think the good businesses for 2021 are going to be tax lawyer and diversity consultant, because that's where the money is going to go. This doesn't empower poor people. This empowers political organizations that keep us in power. And that's it about it. It's not leftism. Socialism is where the government takes over the means of production.
So Neil, where does...
Let me just finish. I have one last thought. What is the system of government that I just described? It's cronyism. It's cronyism with leftist rhetoric organized along racial lines. That is, I think, what you see in the policies going. And I would add, watch the investigations coming. So running the Justice Department is extremely important as well. That's the policy mix, and I think it's a mistake to take the ideology too serious. Let's take the reality and then try to put a word on it. And that's the best, sort of lefty Latin American cronyism is the best I can put on to what I think we'll see.
Hey, Neil, can the Democratic Party find a happy medium when it comes to the virtue and conduct of capitalism?
Well, in some ways, what John's been saying should give us a glimmer of hope on which to conclude our conversation. Because, as I said at the beginning, this is kind of the old progressivism. I mean, just think about it. They're going to put taxes up at the federal level on individual income taxes, on corporate taxes. The rates are going back up to where they were before. I think the 12.4% Social Security payroll tax on earnings above 400,000 is likely to come as well. And capital gains taxation is going to be changed. But it's all kind of a drop in the bucket compared with the spending plans. If they renew all the COVID-19 programs, which I think they plan to do, you're talking 2 to 3 trillion. And then, it could be up to 2 trillion on infrastructure and industrial policy, that kind of cronyism John was talking about. And the reason that I find all of this paradoxically cheering is we know what will happen. This will not be good for economic growth. It will, in effect, Californianize the rest of the country. And as a consequence, I'll make my prediction here and now. The midterms in 2022, if there is a Biden presidency, will be a shocker. There'll be another shellacking. It'll be richly deserved. And hopefully in the intervening 2 years, the Republican Party will have slapped itself in the face, taken a long, hard look in the mirror, and got back to some fundamental conservative principles, because that's what we're going to need in the face of this kind of clapped-out progressivism. By the way, the implications of this policy combination for the US dollar, potentially for inflation, are all pretty grim. And I think back and ask myself, what Democratic administration is this actually going to be like? Is it going to be Lyndon Johnson, who really hit the ground running in his first term with some extraordinarily bold social legislation and civil rights in the Great Society? Is it going to be Clinton? Or is it going to be Obama? Or is it going to be Jimmy Carter? Because when you think back, there's one presidency that the Democrats really can't feel any great nostalgia for, and it's the Carter presidency. And I think there's a lot of Carter coming in the form of Joe Biden, not just generationally, but also in terms of the likely content of policies. So I'm going to just have this little glimmer of hope that what we've seen this week in the Democratic convention is really a kind of extended advertisement for clapped-out progressivism, which will have a kind of 2-year run at screwing up the nation's economy, after which hopefully some sanity will prevail.
HR, you are the 5-star general of optimism when it comes to this broadcast. Why don't you close out on a positive note, something good you just saw this week, and maybe Neil suggesting that perhaps Joe Biden is not going to take us over the cliff. It'll be a little more moderate than we think. What do you think?
Well, I think what we need the vast majority of Americans to kind of reject this kind of ideology associated with kind of critical theory, right? This is this ideology that there are inherent power structures in society that must be torn down. Well, we live in a democracy, right? People actually are empowered to have a say in how they're governed and can demand more from their politicians, and can demand real solutions instead of empty rhetoric and non-solutions. So, okay, if you want an optimistic note, I would just say what is critical is an educated electorate. Let's educate ourselves. Let's learn about these issues, and let's demand more from our politicians of both parties, and recognize that's how we can exercise our power as citizens in our country. And in this election year, as bad as it's going to get, as vitriolic as the rhetoric is going to be, let's be grateful that we live in a democracy. Let's be grateful that we can have these debates and we can have these discussions. Let's reject any kind of an orthodoxy that tells us we have to think in a certain way. And so I think we have a lot to celebrate as Americans. We have problems, yes, we do, but we have a way to self-correct because we have a say in how we're governed, and we can exercise our votes and participate in the democratic process in this crazy next few months.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. John Cochrane, I know you have something you want to say, but let's pick up next week on the Republicans. I'll let you lead off, my friend. And a reminder, we will be back next week. We normally film this on Tuesdays, run on Wednesdays, but I think we're going to film on Thursday next week so we can watch 3 days of Republican convention. And rest assured, we will have some impolite things to say about them as well. So this is not a one-sided episode you're seeing today. So I'd like to thank my colleagues for today's episode. That's it for this week of GoodFellows. On the behalf of the GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, John Cochrane, and H.R. McMaster, all of us here at the Hoover Institution, stay safe and stay healthy. By all means, be careful out there. We'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week.